Case 1. Katrina Shangreaux, Porcupine, South Dakota. The call came from a small home in Porcupine on a summer day that should have passed quietly. By the time help arrived, a 2-year-old boy named Kylen Shangreaux could no longer be saved. Kylen was still at an age where the world was simple. He depended on the adults around him for everything: food, comfort, safety, patience. He did not have words for fear. He did not have a way to leave a room. Like every toddler, he relied on the person who brought him into the world to protect him from harm. That person was his mother, Katrina Pauline Shangreaux, also known as Katrina White Whirlwind. From the outside, there was nothing about the home that warned of danger. It sat in a quiet area of the reservation where families lived close to one another, where children moved freely between houses, where trust was common and questions were rare. In places like this, people assume that if something is wrong, someone else will notice first. Inside the home, Kylen was learning the same things most children his age struggle with: potty training, boundaries, mistakes that come with being 2 years old. But on July 28, 2016, a small mistake became the start of something that could not be taken back. Investigators later learned that Kylin had wet the bed. According to court records, his mother became angry, not just frustrated, angry enough to hurt him. What followed was not one moment. It was a pattern of harm that left marks across his small body. Medical findings showed he had blunt force injuries, consistent with being hit and kicked. There were bite marks. There were injuries to his abdomen. There was damage to his head. There was also injury to his scrotum, a detail that made even experienced investigators pause. These were not injuries a child could cause to himself. They were not the result of a fall. They were not the kind of marks doctors see from accidents. They were signs of abuse. At some point, Kylen stopped responding. By the time help was called, his body had already endured more than it could survive. He was pronounced dead from blunt force trauma. There are moments in cases like this where silence says more than words. This was one of them. Because no child should lose their life over something as small as a wet bed. No child should learn fear inside their own home. As law enforcement began asking questions, the story did not come together cleanly. Family members were present. A grandmother attempted to explain what had happened, but the injuries told a different story, one that could not be softened or redirected. Because Porcupine sits on tribal land, federal authorities stepped in. The FBI Minneapolis Division and the U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Dakota took over the case. Their task was not to imagine what might have happened. It was to prove what did happen. Doctors reviewed Kylen's injuries. Investigators compared them to known patterns of child abuse. The conclusion was clear. This child had been beaten. On August 9, 2016, less than 2 weeks after Kylen's death, a federal grand jury indicted Katrina Shangreaux. She was charged with murder and felony child abuse. As the case moved forward, more details emerged about the trigger that day. Court records showed that the violence was tied to potty training. Investigators learned that Kylen's mother reacted to his accident and to what she described as a sideways look, with physical force. That detail stayed with many people who followed the case, because it showed how thin the line was between normal childhood behavior and fatal harm when patience is gone. For nearly 2 years, The case moved through the federal system. Kylen's name appeared in court filings. His age was repeated again and again, 2 years old. On April 2, 2018, Katrina Shangreaux entered a guilty plea. She admitted to second-degree murder. By pleading guilty, she accepted responsibility for causing her son's death through abuse. There would be no trial, no jury, no dispute over what had happened inside that home. The focus shifted to sentencing. Federal guidelines suggested a lengthy prison term. But when the judge reviewed the details of the case, the age of the victim, the pattern of harm, the nature of the injuries, the court decided that the standard range was not enough. On July 17, 2018, Katrina Shangreaux was sentenced to 40 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised release. The court also imposed a mandatory financial assessment. In explaining the sentence, the judge made it clear that the goal was not only punishment, it was protection. The U.S. Attorney at the time, Ron Parsons, said that no sentence could undo what had happened to Kylen. But he emphasized that the conviction ensured the defendant could never harm another child. The FBI echoed that message. Special Agent in Charge. Jill Sanborn stated plainly that no amount of prison time could bring Kylen back or take away the pain felt by those who loved him. For Kylen's family and the wider community, the loss settled in quietly. There were no public memorials recorded, no large gatherings captured by cameras, just the absence of a child who should have been learning words, asking questions, and growing into his own life. Years later, Katrina Shangreaux attempted to challenge her sentence. She argued that changes to sentencing guidelines should apply to her case. But on November 12, 2025, the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals denied her appeal. The sentence stood: 40 years. In Porcupine, Kylen's name still carries weight. His case became a painful reminder of how quickly harm can happen when frustration replaces care. It also forced a hard conversation about protecting children in communities where trust often runs deep and warning signs are easy to overlook. Because Kylen did not have the chance to ask for help, he depended entirely on the adults around him. And when that protection failed, it cost him his life. Case 2. Billie Jean Red Owl, Kyle, South Dakota. Kayza Jean Red Owl was only 3 months old. At that age, life is measured in hours, not plans. Feeding, sleeping, crying, being held. An infant does not understand hunger or thirst. They only know when something is wrong. Kayza depended completely on her mother, Billie Jean Red Owl. Kyle, South Dakota is a place where families often live close, where relatives step in to help, where babies are passed from one set of arms to another. It is the kind of town where people assume that if a child is struggling, someone nearby will notice. But in 2020, something was already going very wrong inside one home. Kayza had been growing weaker. Those who later examined her body could see signs that do not appear overnight. Her soft spot was sunken deep into her skull. Her throat was dry, rough to the touch. There was no moisture in her eyes, no saliva in her mouth. These were signs of severe dehydration. They meant her body had been without enough fluids for far too long. At some point, someone realized Kayza needed help, not her mother. A third party placed the call after medical care was refused. By the time emergency responders arrived, Kayza was unresponsive. For a baby that young, every minute without care matters. But this was not a sudden crisis. Doctors would later explain that the damage had already been done. At the hospital, medical staff began documenting what they saw. Kayza's condition showed more than one failure. She was dehydrated. She was malnourished. There were marks on her neck that raised further concern. These findings told a clear story. This child had not been given what she needed to survive. As investigators began their work, attention turned to Kayza's mother. Kylin Jean Red Owl was tested the day after her daughter's death. The results showed the presence of marijuana, methamphetamine, and amphetamines in her system. There was no evidence presented of past violent behavior, no public record of diagnosed mental illness, but there was evidence of neglect. And neglect, when it involves an infant, does not need force to become deadly. Federal authorities took over the case. The U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of South Dakota reviewed medical findings, witness statements, and the timeline leading up to Kayza's death. What stood out was not one dramatic moment, but a pattern of absence. Missed care, missed feeding, missed medical attention. Kayza's body showed what happens when a baby is left without the basics for too long. In November 2021, more than a year after Kayza died, Kylin Jean Red Owl was formally indicted. The charges included first-degree murder and felony child abuse and neglect. For the community, the delay only added to the pain. An infant had died in a way that was preventable. And for months, there were no public answers. As the case moved forward, prosecutors laid out the medical facts. They detailed how dehydration affects an infant, how quickly a baby's organs begin to fail, how a sunken fontanelle is not subtle, not hidden, not easy to miss. This was not a sudden illness. This was a slow decline. At some point, Kayza would have cried. At some point, her body would have tried to signal distress. But she had no power to change what was happening to her. In September 2023, Kylin Jean Red Owl entered a guilty plea. As part of the agreement, the murder charge was dismissed. She pleaded guilty to child abuse and neglect resulting in death. The maximum possible sentence under federal law was far higher than what she would ultimately receive, but the plea agreement set limits. On November 29, 2023, Red Owl was sentenced to 2 years and 3 months in federal prison. For many people following the case, the sentence felt difficult to understand. A baby had died. The cause was clear. The harm could have been stopped. But the court focused on the specific charge and the legal standards that applied. In the courtroom, the facts were read into the record. The physical signs, the refusal of medical care. The timeline that showed Kayza's suffering did not happen all at once. There were no long public statements from family members entered into the record, no detailed explanations offered afterward. What remained was the knowledge that Kayza's death did not have to happen. Her obituary listed her name, her dates, a life measured in weeks instead of years. In Kyle, the case stirred quiet fear and grief. People talked about how easy it is to assume a baby is safe when they are with their parent, how quickly things can go wrong when that assumption replaces attention. Doctors who reviewed the case were clear. The signs of dehydration were severe, they were visible, they were progressive. This was not something that appeared in an hour. It happened over time. For many, that was the hardest part to accept, because it meant there were moments when help could have been given, moments when care could have changed the outcome, moments when a call could have been made sooner. Kayza never had the chance to grow into a toddler. She never learned to crawl across a floor or reach for toys. Her world was small, and it depended entirely on one person. When that care failed, her body couldn't survive it. The case left behind a simple truth that is difficult to sit with. Infants cannot wait. They cannot recover on their own. They cannot speak when something is wrong. They rely on adults to notice, to act, and to choose care every day. Kayza Jean Red Owl never got that chance. Case 3. Teresa Bentus, Baby Andrew, Sioux Falls, South Dakota. On a winter morning in 1981, a man named Lee Litz drove along a quiet stretch of road on the east side of Sioux Falls. Frost clung to the grass. His tires crunched over the frozen ground as he tested a vehicle he hoped to buy. There was nothing unusual about the morning, until something bright caught his eye along the ditch. At first he thought it was cloth, maybe a blanket lost in the wind. But something urged him to stop, a feeling he couldn't explain, a nudge that told him this wasn't something to ignore. He stepped out into the cold, breath hanging in the air, and walked toward the ditch. Each step felt heavier than the last. When he reached the bundle and pulled the cloth back, the world seemed to pause around him. A newborn lay there, wrapped in a red blanket, still and silent, as if winter itself had taken him into its arms. And the question that rose in everyone's mind that day is the same one that echoes through this story. How does a child begin and end his life alone in the cold? The investigation that followed would span decades. It would outlive officers, outlast leads, and become one of the most haunting mysteries in Sioux Falls. The baby was given a name by the community, Andrew, because no child should leave this world unnamed. People placed stuffed animals at his grave. They prayed for answers. They spoke his name, even when they had no one to give it to. But the truth about who he belonged to and why he ended up in that ditch remained hidden until nearly 40 years later. Back in 1981, the discovery of the baby shook the town. The blanket he was wrapped in had dried blood on it. The cold had stiffened his small hands. His umbilical cord had not been cut properly, and the placenta was still attached. Medical examiners later explained that he had been alive for a short time before exposure took him. The sight left even seasoned officers quiet. The man who found him struggled to speak when the police arrived. He kept saying the same thing over and over. I don't understand how a baby could be left out here. I don't understand. And for years, no one had an answer. The police worked hard in those early weeks. They searched hospitals, called doctors, checked missing infant reports, but nothing matched. No mother came forward, no witnesses spoke up. The case turned cold faster than anyone expected, but the town didn't forget. Every so often, someone would place fresh flowers by the small headstone that read, Andrew John Doe. The community held a funeral for him, strangers standing together, many crying, some holding their own children close as the casket was lowered. The pastor spoke about the value of every life, no matter how short. And even though the child had no known family there, he was mourned. That was the beginning of a long silence. For 38 years, Andrew's story stayed frozen in time. Then came a breakthrough no one in 1981 could have imagined: forensic genealogy. In 2019, detectives revisited the case with new tools. DNA collected from the blanket decades earlier was tested again. This time, technology had advanced far enough to produce meaningful leads. Analysts found relatives. The family tree began forming. Branch by branch, investigators moved closer to the truth. One day, the results pointed to a woman named Teresa Rose Bentas. When detectives approached her, she was no longer the scared teenager she had been in 1981. She was married, had children, had lived a quiet life. At first, she denied everything, but as evidence grew, her story began to break open. Eventually, she admitted she had given birth alone in her apartment as an 18-year-old. She said she panicked. She said she didn't know what to do. She said she put the baby outside, hoping someone else might find him. But the cold had already settled in that night, and newborns have no protection against winter. Her confession was both a revelation and a heartbreak. People struggled to understand how fear could lead to such a choice. The case stirred old wounds, not because it solved the mystery, but because it reopened the sorrow of a child lost without comfort. When the case went to court, Teresa entered an Alford plea. It meant she accepted conviction for first-degree manslaughter while still claiming she didn't fully agree with the facts. The judge took weeks to consider the sentence. In the end, he handed her 10 years, with 9 suspended. She served only a small portion before being paroled. Some say the sentence felt too light. Others believe the court weighed her age at the time and the decades she lived without reoffending. But no matter what side people stood on, they agreed on one thing. The pain of the case never faded. Even today, people visit the grave where baby Andrew rests. His headstone sits among others, small and simple, often holding a toy placed there by someone who never knew him. A teddy bear, a plastic flower, a note written in marker. You are loved. This case touches people not because of its twists, but because of its quiet tragedy. A newborn left alone, a town that mourned him, a mystery that lasted nearly 4 decades, and a truth that, once revealed, gave many closure but also left new questions behind. Sometimes the hardest stories are the ones that begin before a child even has a chance to cry out for help. And as we move to the next case, another thought settles into the heart. How many stories stay buried for years, waiting for someone to care enough to bring them into the light? Case 4. Maria Milda, Easton, 14 months old. Vermilion, South Dakota. On a cold November afternoon in Vermilion, a quiet call reached the local dispatcher. The voice on the line was strained, pressed tight as if someone was trying to hold themselves together. The caller said a little boy wasn't breathing. Nothing more, no explanation, no story, just those words that freeze a room. My child isn't breathing. When first responders stepped inside the small home, the lights were dim. The air smelled faintly of bath water. A towel sat crumpled on the floor, and in a corner of the bathroom, a child's shirt was still damp, as if the day had gone wrong in ways no one could yet understand. His name was Easton, 14 months old, big eyes, soft cheeks. The kind of child who still clung to the side of a crib when waking up from a nap. And before anyone knew what had truly happened, his life had slipped from this world. Events like this always stir the same question. How does a loving home turn into a place of loss so quickly? At first there was confusion, no signs of forced entry, no struggle in the home. Just a mother, Maria Milda, sitting near the kitchen table with her hands curled into her sleeves, answering short questions while paramedics worked in the bathroom. She didn't cry, she didn't speak much. She just stared straight ahead as officers moved quietly around her. The early report didn't bring clarity, it only deepened the uneasiness. The boy had drowned. But the details weren't lining up with an accident. When the autopsy came back, it revealed more. a traumatic brain injury, something that pointed away from misfortune and toward intention. Detectives returned to the home the next morning. They walked room to room looking for anything that might answer the questions no one wanted to ask. The crib looked untouched. Toys sat neatly in a basket. Everything felt too quiet, as if the house itself was holding its breath. When they spoke to Maria again, she offered something she hadn't the day before, an admission. She said she had drowned her son. The words came out softly, but they were enough to change the entire direction of the case. She didn't argue. She didn't attempt to reshape the truth. She simply said what she had done. Detectives later described that moment as one they could never forget. Not because of anger, not because of shock, but because of the stillness in the room as the weight of the confession settled over everyone present. Maria was charged the next day. News spread through Vermilion quickly. In a town that prided itself on community, on knowing your neighbors, the idea that a child had died like this was hard to accept. People at church prayed for Easton by name. Neighbors left small stuffed animals at the end of the street. Parents held their own kids closer at bedtime. In the courtroom, months later, Maria entered a plea that carried both responsibility and complexity. Guilty but mentally ill to first-degree manslaughter. What she said that day was brief. What she didn't say was louder. Mental health had become a part of the case, but not an excuse. The judge listened to hours of testimony, each minute adding to the sorrow of a life short-lived. The sentencing hearing stretched for nearly 2 hours, an unusually long time for a case already resolved by plea. People filled the benches. Some prayed silently. Others looked down at their hands, unsure how to digest what they were hearing. When the judge finally spoke, the courtroom fell silent. Maria would serve 100 years, with 55 suspended, 45 years behind bars, before she would ever walk outside again. Conditions for her supervised time were strict. Mental health treatment would continue. The community needed assurance. The family needed peace. But justice, as always, is complicated. A sentence can hold a person accountable, but it cannot mend a heart. It cannot raise a child. It cannot erase the moment everything changed. Easton's family carried their grief quietly. They did not make long public statements. They did not seek the spotlight. They mourned him the way many families do, through prayer, through softly spoken memories, through pictures they keep safe in drawers. People in Vermilion still talk about the day they learned what happened. They remember the cry of a siren passing by. The news, shared in hushed tones, the disbelief in neighbors' voices. This case reminded them that heartbreak does not always begin with loud warning signs. Sometimes it grows quietly inside someone who feels overwhelmed and alone. And though the courtroom provided an ending, the story still holds a question that lingers long after the proceedings close. How do you help someone before the tragedy happens? As we move forward, we carry Easton's name with us, not as a case number or a headline, but as a little boy whose life mattered. His story urges us to check on the overwhelmed mother, the tired parent, the person who insists they're fine even when they're not. Because sometimes a single conversation, a single moment of compassion can save a child long before the world realizes that help was needed. Case 5. Amanda Walder, Watertown, South Dakota. The call came from a small daycare home in Watertown on a warm July morning. A caregiver's voice cracked as she told the dispatcher that one of the children wouldn't wake up. She kept saying it softly, almost as if she hoped repeating the words would somehow make them untrue. "He's not waking up. I don't know what happened." When first responders stepped inside, they moved quickly toward a room where a little boy lay motionless. Toys were scattered across the floor. Sunlight poured in through a window, but none of it brought life back to the toddler who had been fine just hours earlier. His name was Liam, 17 months old, a little boy with gentle eyes and a shy smile that warmed everyone around him. His parents always said he brought peace into their home. Even on difficult days, he had a way of softening the room just by being there. But that morning, peace was nowhere to be found. Officers watched as paramedics tried to help him, each attempt followed by a growing silence that filled the house with heartbreak. At first, investigators wondered whether a medical condition had taken a sudden turn. Liam had struggled with health issues before. Maybe this was connected. Maybe it was something no one could have prevented. But the doctors in the emergency room knew better the moment they saw him. The injuries weren't random. They weren't subtle. They didn't match a fall or a bump or anything that could happen in the normal rhythm of toddler play. His tiny body carried trauma consistent with something far more severe, a violent back-and-forth shaking, or his head struck against a hard surface more than once. This wasn't a medical emergency. It was harm. Detectives returned to the daycare for answers. They approached the woman who had been caring for the children that morning, Amanda Walder, a 32-year-old mother who ran a small in-home daycare. She looked exhausted, as if she had lived the entire day in a blur of fear. At first, she said she didn't know what happened. She said Liam suddenly went limp. She said he had been fussy. She said maybe he had hurt himself when she stepped away for a moment. But the timeline didn't fit. The injuries didn't fit. The medical evidence didn't fit. Over the next hours, the truth surfaced piece by piece, each detail more heartbreaking than the last. Amanda admitted that she had lost control, that in a moment where she felt overwhelmed, she acted out of frustration. She never described it with vivid detail, but detectives already knew what the autopsy confirmed. The force used was enough to cause a traumatic brain injury, the kind that stops a child's breathing, the kind that takes a life. Watertown officers documented every detail carefully. This wasn't the kind of case they saw often. It was one that drained everyone involved, not because they didn't know how to do their jobs, but because they wished they never had to. The charge brought against Amanda carried the full weight of that truth. First-degree manslaughter. She could have faced second-degree murder, aggravated battery, and child abuse. Many of those charges were initially filed, but in March 2023, she entered a plea to the most serious of them, the one that acknowledged responsibility while avoiding the long, painful road of a trial. When the case reached sentencing that summer, the courtroom filled to capacity. People stood along the walls because every seat had already been taken. The air felt heavy, not with anger, but with shared sorrow. Then Liam's parents stepped forward. They spoke softly. Their grief wasn't loud, yet it was steady, honest, and impossible to ignore. They talked about their son's kindness, how he loved to be held, how he brightened their days. They said the loss of their child felt like a life sentence they could never appeal. One of them said, "We brought him to daycare because we believed he'd be safe, Those words stayed in the room long after they finished speaking. The judge listened without interruption. She took a long pause before delivering the sentence, a pause that carried the weight of a choice no judge wants to make. Finally, she spoke. 20 years in prison. 20 years for the life of a child who should have celebrated birthdays, run across playgrounds, and grown up surrounded by love. The judge didn't hide her sadness. She told Amanda that no amount of time would bring Liam back. She also told her that choices matter, even the small ones, even the moments of frustration, when patience fades and responsibility feels heavy. Those moments can change everything. Amanda stood quietly as the sentence was read. She didn't make excuses. She didn't try to shift blame. She accepted what the court decided. Outside the courthouse, people gathered in small groups. Some prayed, some cried, some held their children closer. Stories like this always bring the same thought to the front of every parent's mind. What if it had been my child? As the months passed, the case became one families talked about quietly at night, especially parents who used daycare services. They checked in more often. They asked more questions. They listened carefully to their own instincts. And in that sense, Liam's short life changed lives far beyond his own home. His parents created a memorial for him that wasn't about sadness. It was about light. They wanted his name to stand for love, not tragedy. They wanted people to remember that he was more than a case number or a headline. He was a child who giggled, who reached for his mother's hand, who deserved a future. When people talk about this case now, they don't speak only about the legal outcome. They speak about responsibility, kindness, awareness, the importance of caring for children with patience, even on the hardest days. And they speak about a truth that sits quietly in every home and daycare across the world. A child's safety depends on the choices adults make when no one else is watching. And somewhere in that truth lives the memory of a little boy who should still be here. A reminder to breathe, to slow down, to seek help when frustration rises, and to protect the innocent with everything we have. Case 6, Donica Ray Gonzalez, Gan Valley, South Dakota. The call that came into the Brule County Dispatcher on February 21, 2013, carried a kind of fear that leaves no room for misunderstanding. A little boy wasn't responding. He wouldn't wake up. The voice on the line gave short, rushed answers, as if speaking the truth out loud might make it too real. When first responders arrived at the home in Gan Valley, they moved quickly down a narrow hallway toward a room where a 4-year-old boy lay still on the floor. His name was Mason, a child still learning his colors, still reaching up for hugs, still trying to understand the world around him. His small frame showed signs of distress long before a doctor ever laid hands on him. The room was quiet, but it wasn't peaceful. Officers sensed right away that this wasn't sudden illness or an accident. There were bruises, some fresh, some fading, telling a story no child should ever carry. In those first few minutes, responders tried to bring him back. They tried everything they could. But there are moments where time refuses to turn back. Moments where the damage is already too deep. By the time Mason reached medical care, doctors had their answer before they started their exams. He had endured far more than a single moment of harm. Detectives soon learned he had been left that day with a caregiver, 23-year-old Donica Ray Gonzalez, the girlfriend of his father. She had been helping to watch the children. She had been trusted. She had been part of the home. But trust is fragile. And in this case, it broke in ways no one saw coming. During the investigation, a heartbreaking detail surfaced. Something small, something almost ordinary. Mason had wet his pants. A simple, innocent mistake that countless children make every day. Something that should have led to a change of clothes, a reassuring smile, maybe a quiet reminder. Instead, it triggered something inside Donica, something she later struggled to explain. She struck him more than once. She shoved him. She kicked him. And in those moments of anger, she crossed a line that cannot be crossed back. The autopsy confirmed what investigators feared. The beating caused his injuries, and those injuries took his life. Donica's charges reflected the severity of what had happened. First-degree manslaughter and aggravated assault. The legal case moved fast. She was arrested soon after the incident. The community, small and tightly connected, watched the news unfold with disbelief. People who knew the family said they never imagined something like this happening inside the home. A home where they believed the children were surrounded by care. When the trial began in early 2014, the courtroom filled with people who wanted to understand the truth. Donica did not face a minor accusation. She faced a trial that questioned every decision she made that afternoon. Jurors heard the medical findings. They heard how the injuries matched repeated force. They heard about the bruises in different stages. And they heard what the investigators believed. This wasn't one strike or one mistake or one moment of panic. It was a series of choices that left a little boy unable to survive. In April 2014, the jury reached a decision. Donica was found guilty of first-degree manslaughter and aggravated assault. Not guilty on second-degree murder, but still guilty of actions that had taken a life. In July, the judge handed down a sentence that startled the courtroom: 145 years. It was one of the strongest sentences the county had ever seen. The judge said she was essentially serving life. People whispered about whether the punishment was too harsh, too long, too heavy for someone so young, but others said justice had spoken for a child who no longer had a voice. 2 years later, in 2016, a new judge reviewed the sentence and decided it went beyond what the law intended. Donica's sentences were reduced and restructured. Her final punishment became 90 years, with 50 suspended, meaning she must serve 40 years before she can seek parole. Even with the reduction, those who followed the case said the message was clear. A child's life carries immeasurable value, and choices that take that life cannot be brushed aside. Meanwhile, Mason's father carried grief that no parent should endure. He had trusted someone to help care for his children. He had believed his home was safe. And now he was left with memories that would follow him long after the courtroom emptied. People in the community still talk about that winter day. Parents mention Mason's name softly. They speak about how quickly frustration can escalate when a child is learning, making mistakes, trying to grow. And they remind each other that patience matters in the smallest moments, especially when the child involved is still trying to understand the world. Cases like this always leave behind a difficult question. How can something as small as a child's accident lead to a loss so permanent? No answer feels satisfying. No sentence feels enough. But in the sadness, there is still a reminder, one shaped by the faith many families in that region lean on. Every child deserves gentleness. Every child deserves safety. Every child deserves an adult who slows down, breathes, and remembers that no mistake made by tiny hands is ever worth a life. As the years pass, Mason's memory lives on in quiet ways. In the children who now receive extra patience from parents who remember his story, in the caregivers who take an extra pause before reacting in frustration, and in the people who say a prayer for him when they think of February 2013. His life was short, but it changed how an entire county looks at the care of children. And in that way, his story continues to protect others. Case 7. Reni Fiant, Brookings, South Dakota. On a warm July afternoon in Brookings, a woman dialed 911 with a voice so tight it was hard for dispatch to understand her. She said her niece wasn't breathing. Her tone wasn't frantic, it was flat, drained, as if the fear had already settled too deep inside her to rise to the surface. When first responders stepped into the home, they noticed the smell first. Something sour. Something that didn't belong in a house with a young child. They followed the caller down a hallway, each step revealing more than the one before. Clutter, old food containers, and a small area where a child had clearly spent long hours alone. The little girl lay on the floor, her body thin, her skin dry, her eyes closed. There were no toys nearby, no signs of recent play, no blankets that looked clean enough to comfort her. She was 3 years old, a child who should have been running, coloring, laughing, learning new words. Instead, she had been confined, neglected, and slowly starved. The paramedics worked quickly, but deep down, they knew the truth. They weren't saving her life. They were confirming the end of it. When detectives began asking questions, the woman who had called for help, 27-year-old Reni Fiant, the child's aunt and legal guardian, didn't have a clear explanation. She said the girl had been quiet. She said she hadn't noticed anything alarming until that day. But the home told a different story. Her niece had lived with Reni and a co-caretaker, Robert Price Jr., for 2 years. 2 years in an environment that grew more and more unfit for any child, let alone one so small. The first officers to walk the scene later said the silence inside the home stayed with them. It wasn't peaceful or calm. It was the kind of silence that grows after long suffering. The kind that settles in when a child isn't allowed to play, explore, or be held. Autopsy results gave the clearest truth. The child died from dehydration and malnourishment. This wasn't one missed meal. This wasn't a sudden illness. This was a pattern, months, possibly years, of neglect. Investigators returned again and again, building the timeline through medical records, home conditions, and Reni's own statements. The more they uncovered, the harder the case became for the community to accept. People knew the girl had been living with her aunt. They assumed she was safe. They assumed family meant protection. But family doesn't always equal safety. And love doesn't always mean the child is cared for. A grand jury listened to the evidence and indicted Reni on several charges, including second-degree murder. Eventually, after 2 long years of delays, hearings, and evaluations, Reni entered a guilty plea to a lesser but still serious charge: first-degree manslaughter. Her co-caretaker, Robert Price Jr., was sentenced separately to 40 years. When Reni appeared in court for sentencing in September 2021, the courtroom was quiet but tense. The details of the case had already shaken the town. People kept asking themselves how a child could suffer so long without anyone noticing, how neglect could grow in plain sight. how someone charged with raising a child could allow her health to fade day after day. The judge listened to everything: the history, the neglect, the lack of food, the confined space where the girl had spent most of her days. What struck many was how long the signs had been there. The prosecutor put it simply: the lack of care directly caused her death. And when the judge delivered the sentence, it came with a finality that filled the room. 60 years in the South Dakota State Penitentiary. Reni showed little emotion as the decision was read. She had asked for a psychological evaluation earlier in the case, but it didn't change the outcome. The facts were too clear, the suffering was too long, and the child's life was too important for leniency. Outside the courthouse, the community struggled with their feelings. Some were angry, some were heartbroken. Many were both. They talked about how children often can't speak for themselves, how silence doesn't always mean safety, and how caregivers sometimes hide the truth behind closed doors. Neighbors said they wished they had checked in more. Family members said they wished they had noticed signs sooner. A tragedy like this always leaves behind guilt, not only for the person responsible, but for everyone who wonders if they could have stepped in. People placed a few stuffed animals and flowers near the home that week. They didn't hold a large public memorial. They didn't organize a vigil. Their grief was quieter, the kind spoken in kitchens and church pews, the kind where parents look at their own children and hold them longer than usual. The story of this little girl now lives as a reminder in Brookings, a reminder that neglect doesn't always roar. Sometimes it whispers, and those whispers can be just as deadly. For many who follow the case, one question still lingers. How does a child go years without the care she needs while the world outside keeps moving as if nothing is wrong? There's no easy answer. But the truth is simple. Every child deserves food. Every child deserves safety. Every child deserves someone who checks in, notices, and cares enough to act. Her life urges communities to look closer, listen better, and intervene sooner. And for people of faith, her story becomes a quiet prayer. Lord, guard the little ones who cannot speak for themselves, and send help to the children hidden in silence. When you lay these stories side by side, they form a long road no one wishes to walk. 7 children gone far too soon. 7 homes where trust broke, where stress grew in silence, where love was replaced with choices that took lives no child should ever lose. And yet, through all the heartbreak, something else rises, something that asks us to pause, breathe, and see the truth beneath the pain. These cases aren't only about crime. They're about the moments when adults lose their way, moments when anger wins over patience, moments when help isn't asked for soon enough, moments when a child needed someone to step in and no one did. What ties these stories together isn't the darkness, but the light that still tries to break through it. Communities came together. Strangers prayed for children whose names they never knew. Investigators refused to give up, even when years passed without answers. Judges spoke with trembling voices, because they knew the choices they made would echo for decades. And families, some broken, some healing, carried the memories of their children in the quiet corners of their hearts. If there is one thread running through every case, it's this: every child mattered, every smile, every cry, every tiny hand that reached for help. Their lives were small in years, but not in purpose. These cases remind us that protecting children is not only a duty, it's sacred. It's something entire communities must guard with open eyes and open hearts. And for those who hold to faith, it becomes a prayer, spoken softly in the night. Lord, watch over the smallest among us. Strengthen the parents who feel overwhelmed. Send help before harm takes root, and hold close the children who were taken too soon. As we close this chapter, we don't turn away from the sorrow. We honor it. We speak these names so they are not forgotten. We carry their stories forward so that another child might be saved because someone remembered what happened here. And to everyone listening, whether you're a parent, a caregiver, or someone who simply believes in doing good, you can be the person who notices. You can be the one who asks the hard question. You can be the one who steps in before a child is left in danger. That is how healing begins, not with forgetting, but with choosing to care differently tomorrow. Thank you for walking through these stories with compassion. May they stay with you, not as fear, but as a promise to protect the innocent, to speak when silence becomes dangerous, and to hold tight to faith even when the world feels heavy. And may every child lost in these cases rest in peace, held in love, finally safe.